Welcome, everyone. My name is Shankar Prasad, and I am the Vice President for Academic Innovation and Deputy Provost at Brown University. This is the sixth event in our new series of 10 book conversations, Academic Innovation and the Public Good, which includes ongoing dialogues with authors about how education can innovate in ways that are informed, humane, and rooted. Brown is a co-sponsor of the series, along with 17 other higher education institutions that are listed on the slide to come. The series is co-organized by the Stanford Digital Education and Trinity College. Additional partners include the Stanford Humanities Center's Recovering the University as a Public Good initiative and the Stanford Pathways Lab. Each event features a prominent author of a new book in the field in conversation with an expert colleague about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit our event calendar. You can find a link to it in the Zoom chat. We thank those of you who submitted questions for Bill Kirby in advance of tonight's authors conversation in our online community space. At the end of tonight's event, we hope to see you all back in the community space for a continued discussion of the book's theme, The Ascent of Chinese Universities and How They May Challenge American Institutions. Will China threaten American primacy in higher education? Let us know what you think. We'll put a link in the conversation space in the chat. You'll have a chance to talk with others about Bill's ideas for maintaining institutional excellence after the event as well. Plus, for those who post a reflection by Friday, June 24th, you will automatically be entered to win a copy of Bill's forthcoming book, Empires of Ideas. One winner will be selected via random drawing and notified by email. And for those of you who want to grab a copy of Bill's book, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. The link is in this chat. A limited number of signed copies will be available. So with that, I'm really pleased and thrilled to introduce Bill Kirby, Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration and T.M. Chang Professor of China Studies at Harvard University. His book, Empire of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China, examines whether the most preeminent global universities could, in the coming years, be found in China rather than the United States. He will be interviewed tonight by Noah Pickus, Chief Academic Officer at Minerva Project, which combines leading educational science with advanced digital technology to close the widening global skills gap and remedy the dearth of critical wisdom in the world. Thank you both for joining us tonight, Bill and Noah.
Thank you very much for having us.
I'm very grateful to you both for being part of this series. And before I turn it over for what I expect to be an incredibly interesting conversation, let me just quickly outline the format of tonight's program. So this conversation is in part of an ongoing dialogue. As such, we will be leaving the Zoom chat room open for comments and questions. We will be monitoring the Zoom chat for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, and hopefully it won't be, we will remove users from the event. And following the conclusion of tonight's authors conversation, we will open the floor to the audience questions. If you would like to submit a question during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So once again, thank you all for joining us. And now let me turn it over to Noah and to Bill. Thank you both again.
Shankar, thank you. Bill, it's good to see you again.
Great to see you, Noah.
Bill and I have had many travels together in China over the years, and I feel like I've always been just on the boat with him, but we got to do some fun building together. And I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you about this book, Bill. Let me give a sentence background and then just start off with a very broad question for you. You know, the book, it covers 3 countries over 3 centuries. It's focused on the building of the creation of the modern research university. And you talk about the focus on research and discovery and on a broad humane education and about autonomy and governance and the ability of these institutions to operate, all as critical factors. And at the end of the book, you pose 2 really provocative questions and maybe even more provocative answers. So one question is with regard to China. You asked the question about, is there a new model of higher education that China is introducing? after tracing the history of the model from Germany to the US and into China? And your answer to that, I think, is no. And then you ask an even more provocative question, which is, can a world-class research university succeed when it's set in an illiberal society? And your answer to that is yes. And I was struck by those questions and those answers, and I wanted to ask you to use them, if you will, to tell us a little bit more about why you give those answers and to open up the broader conversation here.
Well, I think the answer to the second question was a qualified yes.
Qualified.
Nevertheless, on the first question, is there a kind of a 中国特色的 university these days, distinct from that of the rest of the world? And if those of you who will look at the poster for this event will see that there is a picture of the event taken by a wonderful photographer at Nanjing University. It's of the Beidalo of Nanda, of Nanjing University, a building built in 1919 for what was then called the University of Nanking, or Jining Daxue, designed by an American architect working in China who was enthralled with Chinese architectural style. And any of you who have visited Tsinghua University to see the campus of the original Tsinghua, based to a considerable degree on the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, or the next campus of Tsinghua University, based in part on Moscow State in the 1950s, or Peking University and its beautiful campus today, which was the campus of Yanjing University, also an international architect designing it in Chinese style. The architectural, but above all, the intellectual foundations of every major Chinese university are international in origin. It is being part of learning from, learning with, and in the future, ideally surpassing the great universities of Europe and North America. And that is why one of the excellent questions that was submitted today was about why this obsession today with world-class university? But there's no country that is more obsessed with that and has been more obsessed with it, particularly over the last 20 years, as a marker of excellence and as a marker of progress than China. So they measure themselves by the best, not just of the West, but of the world, including Japan and elsewhere. And we can get into much greater detail about, there are, of course, some distinctive political aspects of Chinese universities, but as research and teaching institutions broadly conceived, they are part of an international fraternity or sorority, whatever gender you wish to use for universities, and that began in the world of modern universities just 212 years ago this year in Berlin. On the second question, because this relates to the German example, can a world-class university, or can a great university, and can a country lead and set global standards in education in a politically illiberal polity, would be one way of thinking of it. The societies, I wouldn't say either Germany automatically or China is an illiberal society, but under an illiberal polity. And the answer then from the German experience, if you look at the rise of the University of Berlin to be the global model for every major research university in the world, and the rise of German universities, by the eve of the First World War, if we had had rankings of the kind that we have today, 8 of the top 10 universities in the world would have been German universities, and the other 2 would have been Oxford and Cambridge. This powerful model grew and developed in Prussia, sponsored by King Frederick William III initially after Prussia's defeat at Napoleon, and grew over the course of Germany's growth and Germany's unification, particularly after 1870, and became a powerful model not just for Germany, but for Europe, and then for North America, and eventually for China. And going back to that Nanjing University campus, Not far from that building is the campus of the former National Central University, established by Chiang Kai-shek in 1930, modeled explicitly on the University of Berlin. And you know it's modeled on the University of Berlin because there's a little Brandenburg Gate welcoming you into it. And the new campus of Nanda, beautiful, beautiful new campus outside of Nanjing, has a replica Brandenburg Gate to welcome you into that as well.
Bill, what your answer reminds me, one of the fun things about traveling with you is whenever you visit a university with Bill, you go to the gate and you take a picture there, which I now see he's been saving up for his book. I think we're identifying two threads here already. And one of them is this question of how governance works in an institution and a university to have it succeed as a world-class research university. And the other is just this more front of mind issue for many people. And so we'll come back to the governance question about the China-US competition in higher ed. And if my teammates have that poll ready, we wanted to pose a question to our audience here about, in the 21st century, will China surpass the US as a preeminent power in education? You only get one choice. You get yes or no here. Go ahead and answer that. And we'll bring that up to see, I'm going to be very curious to see what kind of answers we get here, Bill, and we can talk about the nature of that competitive edge.
I wonder if we'll get different answers by the end of the
term
that we will at the beginning. So
we can come back and ask that as the poll gets populated. When the team is ready to just let us know when we have something there. Bill, so much of the conversation is framed in terms of competition, right? There's the league tables, the rankings, which people complain about and everybody lives by. There's the issues that have been in the news for the last several years about the China 1,000 Talents program and the questions of espionage in the US. Interestingly, we have almost 80% saying China will not surpass the US, and 22% saying it will. What do you make of that response, Bill?
Well, it means, leadership in anything, whether it's in business or education or sports, is a comparative operation. So we have to assume that the people who are saying no here have great confidence in the future of American higher education. And I certainly have great aspirations for the future of American higher education. I wish I were quite as confident as that poll.
Yeah, well, and Martha, and forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Kirps says in the chat, China may surpass the US in technical education, but not in liberal arts education if we maintain our democracy. And
big if.
It's a big if, and to some degree that's a little outside of our remit, but it's not irrelevant here. If we think about taking this question of, now that the competition is global in higher education, and it has these different dimensions, as Martha Purpose says, now that there are these different dimensions. Could you just have a technical university? Bill, can you have a great STEM university without a great humanities and social science university?
Well, let me get back to the first part of her question and remind me to come back to that particular point, because what you and I found when Noah was at Duke University and the leading scholar, the leader of developing the new curriculum for Duke Kunshan University, we visited almost every major Chinese university that was experimenting with a liberal arts program or a general education program. And there isn't a leading Chinese university today that believes that a purely technical education, including the leaders as technical universities like Shanghai Jiaotong or Tsinghua University, who believe that that is sufficient to prepare their students to be leaders of the future. It certainly could be sufficient to prepare people to be expert in the best generation of engineering education, but that's not what they aspire to. And what we found, what you and I found, is that the leaders of these institutions, the presidents and party secretaries, actually believed what we say when we say at Duke or at Harvard or at Stanford, that we believe in an education that is a liberal education, that is to say that it liberates the individual from preconceived ideas, allows them to become independent of mind and real problem solvers. This was the original vision of Humboldt when he founded the University of Berlin in 1810, to help strengthen the country, to be sure, by bringing the best faculty and students together to create knowledge together in a situation of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, of Lehrfreiheit, the freedom to teach, and Lernfreiheit, the freedom to learn. This was never perfectly done, of course, in Berlin or anywhere else that I know of. And it is not perfectly done, or often remotely perfectly done, in China today. And what I often say when I go to China, there were, particularly after 2013, when the Central Committee had a document, so-called document number 9 in 2013, that talked about 7 things that should not be discussed at a university, almost all political terms or sociological terms. I always say that a great university has to be a place where there isn't a single question that cannot be asked, let alone 7. I believe that firmly, but I also know if you look at the great German universities of the 19th century, they were within a comparatively closed social and economic grouping. By the time World War I broke out, the Social Democratic Party in Germany was the largest party. Not a single socialist on the faculty of the University of Berlin would not have been possible in that regard. So there are, and yet, an enormous amount of accomplishment in every discipline, including the humanities, and including critical scholars of German governance, did emerge in those days. So it's possible, but under the Chinese conditions, the levels of control today are considerably greater than those to be found in German universities of the 19th century.
Well, I'm tempted to pick up on your comment of the number of socialists you can have on a faculty and turn to the American example. But let me.
Now we have a great tradition, at least earlier in our histories, of throwing them out as well, or not allowing them in.
That's true.
The question about tech universities. I visited Shanghai Tech right before COVID. It's a new university established by the city of Shanghai. It's modeled on Caltech. But I was struck at the investment of Shanghai Tech in the humanities, in literature, in philosophy, and in the social sciences. And I believe, that the broad beliefs of what makes for an excellent education from the greatest leaders of Chinese university, Tsai Ing-pei in Peking University in the 19-teens, Mei Qi at Tsinghua University in the 1930s and 40s. These people have shared broadly the same values of the greatest leaders of American and European universities. They cannot always act on those values, however.
So, Bill, I felt strongly when we were making those tours of Chinese universities, and I was very concerned about, are we there as competitors? Will we be seen as importing something? And what really gave me conviction and confidence was meeting so many colleagues who said engaging in a joint venture in China and trying to open up space is in everybody's interest. But I want to see if I can use that then to turn the story back to American institutions, because you could say we're asking all these questions about Chinese institutions, But you tell the story of three American universities, and let's pick two to start with, the two privates, Harvard and Duke. And you know, there's a lot of people on this call and who participate in these kinds of conversations whose concern is about American universities and whether they've lost their ambition, whether they've become sclerotic, whether they are able still to innovate, instead of just enjoying the top of the league tables right now, but not being able to carry that forward. Can you tell our audience a little bit about, when you think about the Harvard and the Duke story that you've told, what lessons you're drawing from that about what drives innovation and what holds it back?
Well, I think I'll tell the story that Duke's former president, Dick Broadhead, told in his last speech as president, which was held at Duke Kunshan University, a university that he helped to establish. He had been, when I was dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, Dick was dean of Yale College, very equivalent position than at Yale. And when he left Yale to become Duke's president, people at Yale were shocked. And the student newspaper had an editorial saying something of this sort: "Gee, we thought Dean Broadhead was married to Yale. Now we see that he has left us for someone younger and more athletic on his way to Duke." But when you talk to Dick privately, what he will say is the reason that he left Yale, and I think you could say the same about Harvard and many other long established institutions, was that they suffered from what he called the inertia of excellence. They are so good at so many areas, have been for a long time, have a long trailing reputation, that they become more risk averse, less likely to establish new things, less likely to be first movers in new areas. And you can contrast this if you, in the Harvard chapter that I have, I contrast MIT, not very far away from Harvard, and its neighborhood of Kendall Square, which was a wasteland just 30 or 40 years ago, and is now a center of really national and global innovation. And Harvard and its attempt to build a new campus across the Charles River in the part of Boston called Allston. And if you look at a photograph of Allston, even back in the 1930s, and Allston today, it looks stunningly the same. That's a Duke, by contrast, as a younger institution, a hungrier institution, an institution that had this wonderful, any of you who've ever visited Duke, have this beautiful neo-Gothic campus. But Duke at some point in the 1950s woke up and said, well, we look like a great university, but we know we aren't. We are going to plan time and time again, 3-5-year plans and so on, not Soviet style, but serious academic plans, doing some things that universities almost never do, particularly older ones. You know, what are we going to stop doing? Where are we going to innovate? How are we going to grow? And not simply to grow in the rankings, but to grow in areas of excellence. And the story of Duke, if you read that chapter, is one of extraordinary ambition and a broad success. There isn't a more rapidly rising research university in the United States, in my view, than Duke, and a more ambitious one and successful so far internationally, with its medical school in Singapore, its liberal arts campus in China, a campus that, if it is successful, has the prospect of being the Yenjing University of the 21st century, thinking back to a university that is today's Peking University's campus. So this is ambition of a very special sort that I fear we don't see enough of in other private universities in the United States.
Yeah, and as you know, and as you wrote about, we, coming from Terry Sanford when he was president, we talk about it at Duke as outrageous ambition. I want to pivot off of a comment that Audrey made in the chat about not knowing what is implied by innovation. But if we think of Duke as an example, and we think about being more genuinely global in the way you just described, being, I think it's fair to say, everyone likes to talk about interdisciplinary. I think it's fair to say that Duke put a stake in the ground and accomplished perhaps more than others. They're certainly more civically engaged. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Bill, I call this the two Peter Lang and Lange story, is when I think about our participants in this session here, many of whom are at universities or trying to bring about change. And as was pointed out, Kristen pointed out that, just as you've said, that prestige and success often hamper innovation. But you tell a story at the Free University in Germany and at Duke of not just the leader, but of a set of innovators over time who made changes at significant universities. What can you tell us about that might inform a conversation about how you bring about change in a successful, a prestigious university?
Well, there are individuals who, we always think of looking at, just as we do American history sometimes in terms of presidential reigns, presidential administrations. We think of universities in terms of presidential leadership, and that is important, even though we need to remember that the average tenure of a college or university president in the United States is shorter than the average time of an undergraduate in college. That's in part because undergraduates take longer than you think, and probably longer than they ought to finish college. But great universities also have what, to use the German word, a Berufsbeamtentum, a professional civil service, as it were, a civil service of individuals truly committed to the long-term excellence of the university, of the institution, who serve under multiple administrations, under multiple presidencies, and make a remarkable difference. In the Free University of Berlin, which, as the old University of Berlin declined and then was really destroyed by the National Socialists and by the war, and rebuilt, but then in a not quite competitive way under the German Democratic Republic. The Freie Universität Berlin began as an alternative model. It certainly has had its shares of adventures over the course of its history since 1948, but it has had, over the last 20 plus years, remarkable leadership, not just at the presidential level, but by the individual whose name was Peter Lange, the Kanzler, the guy in charge of the money, but also with really as close as you could be to a provost, a strong provost in the United States. And Duke, at the same time, has a gentleman who was a remarkable provost, the real job, the formal title of provost, Peter Lang, spelled exactly the same way, who made an extraordinary difference in Duke's academic planning, in its internationalization, into the growth of multiple university-wide operations, such as in global health, that really have helped to transform the institution under several excellent presidents. So this is continuity of strong leadership below the absolute leadership, top leadership level, is a central feature. You could see this in China as well. At Tsinghua University, there are several extraordinary individuals who have served multiple presidents and continue to play an outstanding role in the creation of new programs and in Tsinghua's march toward international excellence as well. So it is not just an American or a German thing. It's what makes for enduring greatness in institutions if these people are allowed to work.
Well, I was fascinating reading the book because it made me think about this dynamic where there's, on the one hand, universities, particularly the American universities, have succeeded to some degree because of decentralization, because of gathering great minds and letting them think and do and be creative. And we know that universities are filled with creative people. At the same time, As institutions, universities tend to be more small c conservative. And part of what you tell the story at Duke and at the Free University is about over time, that an innovator is often a central role over time in balancing that dynamic between, Peter Lang once put it to me, drawing the circles and then letting the faculty color within them, but being clear about the strategies and then letting the creativity flow. I was struck that you have a chapter on UC Berkeley, which tells a very different kind of story, where partly because of public disinvestment, right, in higher education, and partly because of a series of developments, including a very democratized faculty and campus, that seem to undercut the ability of that great university to change and innovate at a crucial time. And I'm curious about your thoughts about both about the Berkeley story, but also about this dynamic between decentralization and creativity on the one hand, and planning and central authority on the other, to achieve an optimum degree of preserving the past, but innovating toward the future.
Well, first on the central versus decentralized, there's no institution in the world that I know of that is more decentralized than Harvard. Each school, to a considerable degree, an independent entity, of course, connected to the entire university. And it has been a source of great, this has not always been the case in Harvard's history, but it's been the case largely since the 1960s to today. And it allows for extraordinary entrepreneurialism in different schools, not necessarily by the university as a whole, and makes them hubs of real excellence in the areas, particularly in the professional schools, but also in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and in several of its divisions. A question to be asked is that a sufficient model for the future, in which many of our competitors, particularly if you look across the Pacific to China, are much more central, if not centrally planned. They have a set of objectives, such as Duke has had in its history, that are rather clear, and they have the resources to develop, to gain traction on those objectives. The great tragedy at the moment of American public universities, and I choose Berkeley as an example because Berkeley is the flagship of the greatest system of public higher education in the world, the University of California system, or at least it has been. And I very much hope that it will remain and be as strong as once it was. But it has suffered a dramatic decline in public funding. In one of the richest states, not just in the United States, but on earth, California, a dramatic decline in public funding. So it is, and I think the chapter of that is entitled something like, public university with private funding, or it's more eloquent as the chapter title. I've forgotten the exact title. And it is emblematic because of the American condition. And this is why I was a bit surprised by that poll. 44 out of 50 American states are disinvesting in public higher education. It was this investment in public higher education that has made the biggest difference for American higher education over the last century. If you look at the founding of the land-grant universities and the enormous expansion of public universities in the post-World War II boom of American higher education. And yet, the University of Michigan, a great university, gains no more than 10% of its income today from the state. Yeah. The University of California, Berkeley, just a bit more than that today, but it had been once almost entirely funded by the state. There's a scrambling for resources and a sense that it is not worth the public's investment. And yet California has risen to such extraordinary heights in matters economic and in technology. not the least because of the strength of this system and the investment in this system over decades and decades. And to see that decline and to see the university have to struggle to maintain its excellence is really one part of a coming tragedy of American public higher education. And, you know, for places like Duke and Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, if the great public universities of the United States decline, as they surely will if this trend continues, then the private universities will also decline in part because we compete for the same faculty, we compete for the same graduate students, not always for the same undergraduates, and competition in universities, among universities, just as in business or in any other part of life, is essential to the maintenance of excellence.
So, Bill, I want to pose one last big question before we segue to opening it up to the questions that have been coming in. And I want to go back to the very beginning of the book and the definition of a modern world-class research university, and this combination of Wissenschaft and Bildung, of science and discovery, and of a broad, liberating human formation undergraduate education. I agree that these universities do both of these, and in some ways they go together, but in many ways, our great research universities are sclerotic when it comes to the education part. They are not innovating on that front, and they're not doing it for a lot of reasons. And the key reason is because the incentive runs toward Wissenschaft. And my question for you, other than correcting my pronunciation, I won't try the Chinese, is we're seeing a whole lot of other models emerge right now. Richard Abdul in the run-up asked this question about the whole education ecosystem. And you've got private teaching and learning organizations, you've got new technologies, you've got much more flexible, modular, adaptable kind of learning environments that are both lifelong and available to students right now. And I wanted you to step back from the story of these universities and reflect on that tension in them and what you think about other models to reach a wider group of students in the US or elsewhere that is really focused on learning and not on learning in the context of a research university.
Of course, that is a central question that is often asked. Humboldt believed very strongly in the unity of research and teaching. He didn't believe a university existed simply to pass on existing knowledge, but to create it. And he didn't believe that the best professors, people who would profess their views, could do so without themselves having a real capacity in Wissenschaft, in science of one form or another. And I actually still believe that that's broadly true, but I also do believe that we have the major problem that most of the incentives, I would say until recently, in the last 20 years, almost all of the incentives for advancement of faculty in American research universities have been on the research side and not on the teaching side. I think that's actually improved quite a bit in the leading American research universities over the last 20 years, with an enormous amount of experimentation with and both on this call and the establishment of vice provosts for advances in learning. And the pandemic is in many ways assisted innovation in forms of education and reaching much larger audiences through fora such as this. But at the same time, I think, if you think, I know Harvard better than any other place, and a Harvard undergraduate education, I don't think I'm just making this up, having just completed a term with maybe one of the best classes I've ever taught. A Harvard undergraduate education today is much better than it was 30 years ago. There's much more direct engagement, there's much more direct challenge, there's much more innovation in the classroom than could be found in the old lecture format that was the dominant format of 30 plus years ago. I would say that this is a huge challenge. It's a big challenge everywhere, but it's a huge challenge in particular for Chinese universities, where all, not just most, but all of the rewards are to be found at the moment,
Right.
not in the realm of teaching, but in research. RAISE is based almost entirely on the number of papers in a certain number of journals, how many citations, and so on. Much more intensive than can be found in the American or European systems today.
Yes.
And a much greater distance in classes that are much too large between faculty and students. That is something that, for the aspirations of those who seek a liberal education or better general education in Chinese universities, that is a major challenge to overcome.
So I'm going to use this to segue to the questions. I will say that on the one hand, part of your answer about China is precisely why I think places like Duke Kunshan and NYU Shanghai and others are so vital, and with the students there just so engaged in that kind of learning, and I think it has a lot of value to add. Having said that, the place I will diverge from you is, while I'm sure Harvard has gotten more engaged, my colleagues at Stanford and at Trinity and at Brown and in other places are all working very hard on this. I think they work inside a system that is still much more attuned to that Humboldtian notion, still very much. And the problem with Humboldt is he thought that teaching was about that you just transmitted it. And so it couldn't be just transmission. But if teaching is really engaging students and drawing them out and making their purpose and development central, I have to say, I have a lot of doubts about how well we do that. And particularly how well we do that without students who are pre-selected to succeed in that. So
Right.
I'll make that my statement, and then Bill, I wanted to get in.
You go ahead. The one thing I'd always say that I add, and the great need is for an expansion of the platforms for teaching beyond these universities today, because none of these elite universities in the United States have grown in any significant way over the last 50 years. The population has grown significantly and become much more diverse, and it is not. And these institutions can serve an increasingly small percentage of those who have the privilege to go to university.
So that's a good connection, Bill, to, we've got a couple of questions. Some are around China, and we'll come back to that. But here we have some questions in the US and more broadly that are about research doesn't just go on in universities. There's government-led projects. There, whether it's NASA or the Manhattan Project or it's Google and Facebook today. And the question is, should universities compete? Should they collaborate with these entities? How do you see the research landscape in a world where there's so much being poured into research outside of universities?
Well, this is another example of a German model, the establishment of what were called the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft Institutes. Today we know them as the Max Planck institutes that exist outside of universities, but today increasingly collaborate with German universities in research primarily, but occasionally also in teaching. You have certainly, you can see in Berkeley with the national laboratories sitting above the campus, strong areas of cooperation, not simply neighbors without interaction. So it certainly does exist, and so they compete. In fact, for faculty, they compete for postdocs, but they also collaborate very closely. How much? It's a good question. I don't know distinctively how. You see this in China too, with the initial Soviet model of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Academy of Sciences, which dominated certain areas of research to the detriment of Chinese universities in the 1950s through to the 1970s. But today, the greatest scholars, by and large, are not to be found in those Soviet-style institutes, but in the universities.
Well, so there's a great question here from Sergio, which essentially asks a version of this same question with regard to China and China-US competition. He asks, if China is one of the main leaders of edge technologies, such as AI and electric vehicles and big data, isn't it achieving leadership in higher education in this century just a matter of time?
Well, of course it could be. But it's a matter of time, but it's also a matter of competition and cooperation. As you know, Chinese universities have grown on international models and by sending students both abroad and coming back. Just as in the 19th century, a leading American university wouldn't hire somebody without a PhD from Germany. Today, a PhD from the United States or Europe or Japan is one of the absolute necessary passports to an academic position in the leading Chinese universities. They surely in time will increasingly, given the quality of these institutions, be creating their own faculty through their own doctoral programs, which are becoming stronger and stronger, doctoral programs that will educate many people from around the world, increasingly in some areas in English, not simply in Chinese. But it's really, again, this question of, it isn't just a matter of time. It has to do with what happens in the United States and elsewhere. Absolutely, if I were buying an electric car, if I were convinced to invest every dime that I have in the electric car industry, I would invest in a couple of companies in China before I would invest in some others. And I would invest, I think they will be the leaders in that area. AI is a matter of competition that will be ongoing for a long period of time. But, you know, it isn't absolutely, this is one of the things that worries me. This is a different question, worries me about America-China policy today and about Chinese anxieties about the United States. The belief that one or the other has to dominate. My view is China can Chinese universities lead in the 21st century? Absolutely, but they cannot lead alone. They have grown as part of an international system of higher education, and that's the system they want to grow in, to compete in, and at the end of the day, to lead, but not alone.
So, Bill, I love that. I love that way you put it, but let me push back here. I have to be tentative here because I'm speaking to a historian, but isn't the story of Germany's rise and then the American adoption of the German model and post-World War II, the takeoff there and the decline of German universities for political reasons and for all the other reasons you tell. And there's some resurrection going on right now. You talk about the Excellence Initiative in Germany. But if I just look at that history, I can say, sure, there's collaboration, but basically the German model was the dominant one. Then the American adopted it and built it out. And that there's got to be a winner here. I appreciate the desire. I would like it to be international and collaborative, but what's the evidence we have that that's the case as opposed to being supplanted?
It's a good point. There isn't a country that will be deemed in retrospect to have been a leading power in the world. Whether it's France in the 18th century, Germany and England in the 19th century, the United States in the second half of the 20th century, a leading power in the world that has not also been a leading power in education and culture and, shall we say, values. Broadly, a place that other people want to learn from and go to. China has that capacity, to be sure, but the greatest limitation on China's capacity to become that leader, as distinct from the United States, as distinct from one of the leading centers of higher education in the world, which it, in my view, it already is the political constraints put on by the Chinese Communist Party. You ask any leader of some of the great leaders of Chinese higher education today, whom I've had many private conversations with, what is their biggest challenge in moving the university to the next level? And the answer is always the party.
Mhm. So I'm struck by in some ways, the parallels here, not the discontinuities between the US and China in the questions we're getting in this conversation. In the book, you quote former Harvard president Drew Faust. I think it was on the opening of the Harvard Shanghai Center. All right, I've got that right, about we're truly entering an era of universities without borders. Now, that could mean many things. One is it means Harvard is everywhere, right? Or Duke or Berkeley.
Right.
Or it could mean there's lots of collaboration, and there's Harvard and there's Tsinghua and there's Berkeley and there's Miami-Dade Community College, and there's lots of there's a changing ecology there. And but this competition versus collaboration, there's a question here from Martha Kirpis, I hope I'm getting that right, about corporatization slowing innovation in American universities. But if you imagine on a competitive standard, the Chinese universities and Chinese government investment in AI and other areas set against a corporate and American university collaboration. In other words, you've got government and you've got universities that to succeed have to compete, have to collaborate nationally to compete against each other. Is that the nightmare vision that of a future for you?
No, it's not. I mean, I think what we're missing here are and you're painting it as it's one country has to lead and another country has to lose.
Right.
I really do disagree with that. I think we're at a moment in U.S.-China relations broadly conceived that is coloring our academic relations in a very unhappy way. The Americans are at the moment more than a little bit paranoid by their loss of prestige in the world, by the sense that we're no longer the leaders. You look at IT and you look at, say, going into the 5G generation in telecommunications. Well, Huawei is very good at that. The Americans don't have a single entry in that game.
Mm-hmm.
We're out of that business. And it becomes a highly politicized operation. We're very fearful of this, of our own sense of vulnerability. And the Chinese are, and particularly the Chinese Communist Party, is paranoid about what are the true aims of the Americans. Is it political change? Is it something else? And yet, in my view, it's precisely at moments like this, when political relations are so fraught,
Mm-hmm.
that universities can find ways of working together on areas to solve common problems and issues, whether huge missed opportunity on COVID-19, but we had worked very closely, Harvard and other institutions, very closely with our Chinese colleagues on SARS and in the aftermath of the SARS epidemic, brief, though powerful as it was, on climate change, but also in areas of this, in the social sciences and natural sciences. There's extraordinary areas of collaboration. As at Duke and at Harvard, 90% of the faculty members who want to do research in China and with Chinese colleagues are not China specialists like me.
Right.
They're in School of Public Health, they're in the School of Education, they're in every different area that you can think of in the natural, social sciences and humanities, but not necessarily in China studies.
Right.
And here I will say this was our own president, Harvard's president, Larry Bacow, met in 2019 with President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. And the conversation was how universities could continue to collaborate in a time of political tension. And certainly from our point of view, but also President Xi's rhetoric at that time was very strongly affirmative of that. This is why we should not fear borders. We should not fear national borders in our own interaction, in our own investments in the future? You want to build up a great engineering program in a university that doesn't have one, or doesn't have as good a one as they would like? Try and collaborate with a Chinese university that may be better than you are in that area. For some reason, we don't do that, and we don't look abroad for new models for American higher education.
Well, I love the idea. As great as the American system is, looking abroad and looking internally is something that I think is incumbent upon us. I want to, you get 2 minutes to answer this question, and then we're going to turn it back to Shankar.
Okay.
But I set you up. I played the competition card, and I set you up for the collaboration answer. Now I want to give you a chance to defend the humanities. We have a question from John Peterson, which is focused on the influence that universities have in K-12 education and making the focus much more on pre-professional and STEM orientation, and driving the admissions process in that way. And the question is, how should we address that? Or is that a problem? And what do you think we could do about that?
So we in the United States, or
This
we and China?
Well, why don't we do it together?
Yeah. Well, you know, there isn't a group of humanists in any American universities that is not firmly convinced that there is a crisis of the humanities in the United States. And I would agree that in many, many institutions, not my own, I should say, but in many, many institutions, that we have a severe crisis of both underfunding and a lack of focus in undergraduate education that has the humanities take the central role that they really ought to have. There was a good reason why Humboldt believed that the philosophical faculty, what we would today call the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, had to be at the center of any great research university. But, you know, our Chinese colleagues, let me just complete this one thought. They know much better than we do what a real crisis of the humanities is.
Yeah.
They have seen the destruction of their own country's humanistic tradition in the Maoist period of the 1950s, and then brutally so in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. And they have had to reconstruct slowly and painfully outstanding centers of humanistic inquiry, largely in the Chinese tradition, but also internationally, because they have seen what happens when a country loses its cultural foundation and its moral moorings. They know this crisis much better than we do. And this too is an area, I hope, of future cooperation.
Bill, it's been a pleasure. I think, Shankar, we're over to you.
Wonderful. Well, I hate to end an incredibly stimulating conversation that could go on for much, much longer, but let me thank you, Bill. Thank you, Noah, for really a stimulating dialogue, a conversation. One of the goals of this series is to have conversations and not just speeches. And I think what you've demonstrated that beautifully. So thank you for a stimulating discussion and really an eye-opening discussion. And let me thank you also our terrific audience for their engagement and the questions they brought forth prior to this event and during this event. So thank you both. Just a couple of reminders before we close. Again, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of Bill's book, and I highly encourage you to do so, please visit this website, bookculture.com, to pick up your own copy. And as a reminder, there'll be a limited number of signed copies from Bill. We also encourage you to share your thoughts on tonight's conversation in our online conversation space. One of the questions we'll be thinking about are what are the models from abroad that could spur innovation within the United States and across our institutions, and we'd love to hear what you think. And you can find the link on the website here shown on the screen. And finally, let me just remind you that we have another event coming up next Wednesday, July 27th. This event will feature Ethan Reese, who's the Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Nevada in Reno. Ethan will be in conversation with Eddie Cole, who's an Associate Professor at the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. Ethan's book, Other People's Colleges, the Origins of American Higher Education Reform, will draw insights from today for his analysis on the early 20th century effort by the elite external reformers to reshape higher education. Your feedback is important to us. We'd love to hear what you thought of tonight's presentation by filling out our post-event survey, which you can find a link, I believe, on the next slide. And once again, Bill and Noah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.